The scream echoed through the pines long before anyone saw the fire. It was just after midnight when a passing truck driver spotted the orange glow rising from the old chapel off County Road 12. By the time he reached it, the wooden structure was engulfed, its stained glass collapsing in sheets of molten color. Inside, they found 3 bicycles leaned neatly against the wall, but no sign of the teenagers who rode them there that night. Whitefish Falls would wake to the smell of smoke and the beginning of a nightmare that would last 50 years. Their names were Thomas Reed, Claire Dawson, and Mark Halpern. They were 17, inseparable, and last seen heading to the chapel to interview a retired preacher for a school project about local faith communities. The preacher was gone, so were they, and from that moment, nothing in this town ever felt holy again. Half a century later, a construction crew digging the foundations for a new church unearthed what law enforcement had prayed would stay buried evidence that proved the fire had been no accident and that the chapel had been hiding something much darker than worship. This is the case of Whitefish Falls, 1974, a story of faith, fear, and the secret cult that turned a quiet Montana town into a graveyard of silence. Before we uncover what really happened that night, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on how far you think people would go to protect their God. The fire started just after midnight on October 14th, 1974. The air in Whitefish Falls was sharp with the scent of pine and early frost, and most of the town had already gone to bed when the first glow rose above the tree line. Truck driver Daniel Pierce was hauling lumber to Kalispell when he noticed the light flickering through the trees near Chapel Hill Road. At first, he thought it was a campfire, until the flames shot high enough to touch the sky. He braked hard, gravel spraying under his tires, and ran toward the old wooden chapel that everyone in town called St. Bartholomew's, though no one had worshipped there for years. The door hung open. Heat rolled out in waves that peeled the paint from the walls. Inside, pews were burning like matchsticks, collapsing one by one under the weight of the roof. Daniel shouted for anyone who might still be inside, but the only sound was the crackling roar of the fire and the faint groan of falling timber. He stumbled back, coughing, and that was when he saw them. 3 bicycles leaning neatly against the side of the chapel. No riders, no footprints leading away. Only those bikes, polished clean and lined up as if waiting for their owners to return. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived from town, there was nothing left to save. The chapel collapsed in on itself just before dawn, leaving behind a smoking crater filled with blackened beams and shattered glass. Sheriff Alan Dorsey stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the twisted remains while the first light of morning crept over the hills. He had seen barn fires before, hunting cabins, even a gas station explosion back in '69. But this one felt different, too deliberate. The flames had burned evenly from the center outward, the kind of pattern that usually meant accelerant. And then there were the bicycles. When Dorsey radioed dispatch to check missing persons, he was told 3 high school seniors had failed to return home the previous night. Thomas Reed, son of a local mechanic. Claire Dawson, whose mother worked at the diner on Main Street. And Mark Halpern, quarterback of the Whitefish Falls Eagles. They had borrowed a tape recorder from the school library for a class project on the history of faith in rural Montana. Their plan had been to interview Reverend Albert Graves, the chapel's last caretaker before it closed. But Graves had vanished from town 2 years earlier, leaving behind only unpaid taxes and rumors of strange gatherings in the woods. Fire investigators found traces of lamp oil near the altar and a half-melted metal symbol in the ashes, shaped like a circle surrounding an inverted cross. Dorsey pocketed it before anyone else could see. Something about it made his stomach turn. When the remains cooled, They sifted through the debris for bodies, but there were none. No bones, no teeth, no sign that anyone had died in the fire. It was as if the three teenagers had simply walked into the flames and disappeared. That afternoon, townspeople gathered behind the yellow tape, whispering prayers and rumors in equal measure. Some said the kids had joined a commune in Oregon. Others swore they had been taken by the same hill sect that used to meet at the chapel years ago. No one wanted to believe the truth might be worse than both. Sheriff Dorsey closed his notebook and looked once more at the ashes. He knew the town would beg for answers he did not have. But deep down, he already suspected the fire at St. Bartholomew's was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The sheriff could not sleep that night. The smell of burnt wood still clung to his jacket, and every time he closed his eyes he saw those 3 bicycles lined up against the chapel wall like a photograph that refused to fade. He sat at his kitchen table with a pot of black coffee and the brass button in front of him, turning it over again and again under the light until he could read the words more clearly. Order of the Hollow Faith. He remembered hearing it whispered years ago when he was still a deputy. A name people only spoke when they had too much to drink stories about a secret congregation that broke away from the Lutheran Church in the 1950s. A group that met in the woods to practice something they called the purification sermons. No one ever proved it existed, but people said strange things happened near Chapel Hill. Animals found skinned and arranged in circles. Farmers hearing singing at midnight, then finding their fields scorched the next morning. And every time the sheriff tried to trace those rumors, the trail led back to Reverend Albert Graves, the man who had vanished without a trace 2 years before the fire. Dorsey drove to the county records office before dawn. The clerk on duty barely looked up when he asked for the church's file. Most of it was routine permits, land deeds, insurance papers, but one document stopped him. A letter from 1968 signed by Graves himself requesting permission to expand the chapel basement. Even though the church had less than 10 members left, the plans showed a hidden room beneath the altar. No official inspection record. No final approval stamp. The sheriff felt his throat tighten as he traced the outline with his finger. That basement had not been on any fire map. He returned to the ruins at sunrise with Deputy Callahan and 2 volunteers armed with shovels. The ashes were still warm when they began digging where the altar once stood beneath a layer of blackened stone. They found the entrance a square of warped metal, half melted from the heat when they pried it open. A rush of stale air escaped, carrying a smell that was not just smoke, but something older. The steps below were carved directly into the earth, leading into darkness. The sheriff descended first, his flashlight cutting through the dust. The space was small, no bigger than a bedroom. The walls lined with wooden, shelves burned but still standing on one of them. A stack of glass jars sealed with wax. Inside each jar floated something pale and shapeless, small enough to fit in a child's hand. The deputy gagged and stepped back, but the sheriff forced himself closer. His beam caught a shape etched into the wall, the same symbol as on the button, the circle and the inverted cross beneath it. Words painted in a faded red pigment that might have been paint, or might have been something else. We are the Hollow. We wait for the return. He took photos with the department's Polaroid camera and marked the location on a map. But even as he climbed back to the surface, he felt it deep in his gut. This was not the place where the teenagers died. This was where someone prepared for them. That afternoon, the town council met at the high school gym. Everyone wanted answers. The sheriff told them about the hidden basement, but left out the jars. The whispers grew until Pastor Aaron Leeds, the town's current minister, stood up and said that St. Bartholomew's had been cursed long before the fire, that Reverend Graves had gathered followers who believed that faith must be proven through sacrifice, that they called themselves the Hollow Ones, and that they promised eternal purity through burning away sin. When someone asked how he knew all this, Leeds looked down at his hands and said, "Because I was one of them once before, I found the real light." The crowd erupted, but through the noise the sheriff heard one quiet question from the back. Someone asked if the cult had ever stopped, and Leeds said softly, "Not until the fire." The sheriff barely made it home that night. The smell of ash and damp earth clinging to his clothes as if the fire had marked him. He poured whiskey into his coffee and stared at the Polaroids spread across his kitchen table. The jars, the symbols, the words carved into the wall. They pulsed behind his eyelids. Every time he blinked, he told himself it was just evidence. But in the quiet of that small Montana house, it felt more like a warning. He had seen darkness before, but this one breathed. The next morning, Deputy Callahan walked into the station holding a cardboard box from the high school library, her face pale. She said the librarian had found it in the lost, and found buried behind old yearbooks inside was a portable tape recorder with a cracked microphone cord. A label on the side written in neat cursive, Project Faith Interview 1. The date read, October 13, 1974, the day before the fire. Dorsey took the recorder into his office, shut the blinds, and pressed play at first. Only static filled the room. Then a young male voice, clear and nervous. "This is Mark Halpern with Claire Dawson and Thomas Reed. We're at St. Bartholomew's Chapel to interview Reverend Graves for our local history project." There was laughter, faint echo of footsteps on wood. Then Claire's voice, soft but bright, asking the first question about the church's founding. There was a pause. Then another voice, older, slow, calm, the kind that made the hair rise on your neck. Reverend Graves, answering that the chapel was not built for worship but for cleansing, that his congregation believed the body was a vessel, and the vessel must be emptied to be filled with light. The sheriff felt his stomach knot as the tape hissed. Then Claire spoke again, asking what kind of cleansing he meant. The old man's answer came like a whisper so low, Dorsey leaned closer to hear the kind that leaves no shadow. There was movement on the tape, shuffling. Then Mark saying something about hearing people outside, and Thomas laughing nervously. Then a sudden bang, a door slamming, the sound of heavy breathing, and Graves shouting words in a language none of them could understand. The final seconds were chaos, feet running, someone screaming, the microphone hitting the floor. Then silence. The sheriff sat frozen, the clock on the wall ticking far too loud. He rewound the tape, once more listened again. This time noticing something beneath the panic. A rhythmic sound, almost like chanting, faint but distinct. "We are the Hollow. We wait for the return." He called the state police that afternoon requesting forensic analysis, but the dispatcher hesitated. Said they had no resources for old fires, no evidence of a crime. Yet just 3 missing kids and a burned-down chapel. Dorsey hung up before he said something he would regret. By evening, the whole town knew about the tape word had leaked from the library. Parents gathered at the station demanding answers. The sheriff refused to play it for them, saying it was still evidence, but the whispers spread faster than truth. They said the teenagers had recorded their own deaths, that their voices had called from the fire, that their souls were trapped in the ashes of St. Bartholomew's, and that the hollow faith had returned to finish what it started. That night, when the sheriff locked up the station and stepped out into the empty street, he could swear he heard a faint sound carried on the cold wind through the trees at the edge of town. A child's voice repeating what was on the tape. "We are the Hollow. We wait for the return." The next morning brought frost thick enough to turn the trees white, and when the sheriff stepped out of his truck, the air stung like glass. The tape recorder sat on the passenger seat, wrapped in a brown evidence bag as if the silence inside it could still bite. He drove to the courthouse archives in Kalispell, searching for any trace of Reverend Albert Graves. But what he found made no sense. The church records showed his name on a death certificate dated June 5, 1972. Cause of death listed as accidental fall at his home. Yet there was no coroner signature, no burial record, and no obituary in the local paper. The sheriff checked the address listed on the file, an old parsonage on Miller Creek Road, when he arrived. The house was gone, burned to its foundation, overgrown with wild grass and thorned vines, as if the land itself had swallowed it. He climbed the steps that were no longer there and noticed the mailbox still standing, leaning crooked, with the name Graves barely legible beneath a layer of rust. He bent to open it. Inside were papers fused together by rain, and years he pried them apart with his knife, revealing a single envelope still sealed, stamped, but never sent. It was addressed to the Whitefish Falls Sheriff's Office. Postmarked 1 week before the fire, inside was a single sheet of paper on church stationery, with handwriting so shaky it barely held the letters together. "They are awake below the chapel. The children should not come here. Tell them to stay away. I cannot stop what is coming." Signed, simply. A.G. Dorsey felt the chill crawl up his spine. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into his coat pocket, driving straight back to the station where Deputy Callahan waited. She told him someone had broken into the evidence room. Nothing was taken except the tape recorder. The lock had been forced clean open. The sheriff swore under his breath. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. He ordered her to check the logs, but there was nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, just the door swinging in the cold. By evening, word of the break-in had spread through town like gasoline on dry grass. Families began boarding up windows, refusing to let their children walk alone. The pastor canceled Sunday service, saying the congregation needed time to pray privately, and for the first time in years, the church bells of Whitefish Falls stayed silent. That night, the sheriff sat in his office staring at the stolen evidence form the fire outside the window, crackling in the cold wind. He thought about the letter and the words, "They are awake below the chapel." He pulled out the map of the old site, traced the outline of the ruins and the basement beneath it, then circled the area marked as an unused mine shaft less than a mile away. It had been sealed in 1959, after a cave-in killed 3 workers, but some of the old logs mentioned a connection tunnel running toward the chapel. He drove out there alone before dawn, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other. The forest was silent, his breath clouding in front of him. He found the old entrance behind a fallen pine, the boards rotten and half buried in moss. He pried them loose. The smell that came out was thick and sour, like wet soil mixed with decay. He stepped inside the beam of his light, cutting through the dark. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls damp and trembling with the sound of dripping water. Then something else, a whisper so soft he thought it was the wind, until he heard it again. Words almost identical to the ones from the tape. "We are the Hollow. We wait for the return." He raised the light and saw marks on the walls, hundreds of handprints, small, like a child's, pressed into the stone, each outlined in soot, each facing inward as if the darkness itself had been worshipped. He turned back toward the entrance, heart hammering, and when he looked up, he saw a single shape standing at the mouth of the tunnel, tall, thin, dressed in black. The face pale, the eyes reflecting the light like an animal's, and though he had never seen the man before, he knew immediately who it was. Reverend Albert Graves, and he was not dead. The sheriff stumbled out of the tunnel before the sun had fully risen, his lungs raw from the damp air, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the flashlight. The figure at the mouth of the cave was gone, but the echo of that whisper clung to his ears like smoke. When he reached his truck, he drove without thinking, the headlights carving through the mist, the road empty except for the flicker of ravens circling above Chapel Hill. He told himself he had imagined it. The shape, the eyes, the sound of those words, but the mud on his boots said otherwise, and the smell of decay followed him all the way back into town. By the time he arrived at the station, the streets were already stirring people, moving in uneasy silence. Windows opening, then closing again. Curtains shifting like watchers in the dark. The town had changed overnight, and he could feel it in the air like static before a storm. Deputy Callahan met him at the door, her face drawn. She said the pastor had called an emergency prayer gathering at the community hall. Every family was there, and they were asking questions about him, about what he had found, and why he had kept it secret. She said someone had spread the story that the sheriff had brought the curse back, that the fire was only the beginning, and that the hollow faith had chosen him next. He walked into that hall anyway, the doors creaking loud enough to hush the room inside. Nearly every resident of Whitefish Falls sat in the folding chairs lined in rows, their faces pale, their eyes hollow with sleeplessness. Pastor Leeds stood at the front under the faint glow of a single bulb, reading from the old Bible in a voice that shook with conviction. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Dorsey. The silence that followed was thick as tar. The sheriff lifted the envelope, the letter from Graves, and told them the truth that the Reverend was alive, that the fire had been no accident, and that someone in this very room had stolen the tape that could prove what happened to the 3 missing teenagers. But before he could finish, someone shouted, "Liar!" Another voice screamed heresy, and suddenly the hall erupted, people on their feet shouting over one another, accusing him of blasphemy, of desecrating holy ground, of dragging the town's name through the mud. One man threw a chair, another spat at his boots. Deputy Callahan tried to pull him out, but he stood frozen watching as faith turned to fury in faces he had known his whole life. When they finally escaped into the cold air outside, he heard the doors lock behind them, the congregation inside beginning to chant the same words from the cave. "We are the hollow, we wait for the return." He backed away, the sound rising like a storm, until it filled the entire street, vibrating through the ground under his feet. He knew then that whatever was happening was no longer buried in the past. It was here, awake, breathing through every person who still called this town holy. That night, his phone rang just before midnight. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted by static but unmistakable. It was Thomas Reed's voice. One of the missing teenagers, he was whispering the same phrase again and again. "They never left. We're still here below the hill." Then the line went dead. The sheriff stared at the receiver until the dial tone dissolved into silence. At dawn, he drove back to Chapel Hill, the fog heavy as smoke. The forest dead quiet when he reached the edge of the ruins. The ground looked disturbed, as if something beneath the ashes had shifted in the night. and for the first time since the fire, he realized he was not investigating a case anymore. He was standing in the middle of a resurrection. The ground at Chapel Hill was colder than it should have been. The ash, long settled yet still breathing faint wisps of smoke that curled upward like something exhaling from below. The sheriff knelt in the dirt, his gloved hands brushing aside charred stones until his fingers struck wood. Not a coffin, not debris, but something flat and hollow. He cleared it carefully, layer by layer, until the outline of a trap door appeared scorched but intact. He pulled at the handle, and it lifted easier than he expected, as if someone had opened it recently. Beneath was a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. The same damp breath he had smelled in the tunnel rising to meet him. He hesitated only once, then switched on his flashlight and descended. The air grew thick with the scent of rot and candle wax. The walls were carved into the rock itself, smooth in some places, clawed in others, and all along them hung metal crosses twisted into circles, the mark of the hollow faith. On the final step, he stopped the beam of his light, catching movement ahead. A flicker, then stillness. He moved forward slowly, until the light revealed the outline of a room larger than the basement he had found before, and at its center a circle of stones blackened by fire and surrounded by 3 wooden chairs. Each burned halfway to the ground. Around them lay small white fragments that at first looked like shells until he realized they were teeth, human teeth. He crouched low, his breath shaking as he studied the floor symbols etched deep into the stone. Each one a variation of the same phrase the vessel must be emptied on the far wall. He saw shelves again, but these were not lined with jars. They were filled with books, handwritten ledgers bound in leather covered with dust. He opened one, and the first page read Confessions of the Faithful. 1974 inside were names, dozens of them. The signatures of townspeople, people still living, people who had stood in that community hall the night before under the word offering. Each name was followed by an object, a time, and a verse. Then he saw them, the last 3 entries, Thomas, Reed, Claire, Dawson, Mark Halpern. Their names written in the same trembling hand, and next to each a single word ascended. His stomach turned as he turned the page and found photographs glued to the paper, black and white grainy images of the teenagers sitting in the chapel smiling, unaware the handwriting beneath read the chosen ones. The light within them burns brightest. He closed the book and pressed his fist against his mouth, trying not to be sick. Behind him, something moved a slow scrape against stone. He turned the flashlight, shaking in his hand, the beam catching a figure standing in the doorway. Its skin pale, its clothes covered in dust, its eyes glassy and unblinking, and for a single impossible second he thought it was Thomas Reed, the same boy from the photo, the same eyes, the same hair. Only now there was nothing human behind them. The boy opened his mouth, but no sound came. Only a long breath that seemed to echo the chant that had haunted the sheriff's nights. We are the hollow, we wait for the return. Dorsey stumbled backward, tripping over one of the burned chairs, the light jerking across the walls where he saw dozens of photographs nailed in crooked rows. Every one of them showing people from the town, not dead, not alive, just standing in the woods, eyes rolled white faces lit by firelight as if caught in prayer. The figure stepped forward, and the sheriff fired his revolver once the sound exploded through the chamber. When the smoke cleared, the boy was gone. The only thing left was the faint sound of whispering coming from the hole in the floor beneath the stone circle. He leaned over the edge, shining his light down into the black. Nothing moved, but the darkness seemed to pulse like it was breathing. And then he saw it, not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but a shape far below, like something vast and coiled waiting. He stumbled back up the stairs, his lungs burning, and when he burst through the trap-door into daylight, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains, turning the sky blood-red, the entire town visible below as if waiting for him. And for the first time he understood the truth. The hollow faith had never died, because the people who fed it still lived above its bones. The sky over Whitefish Falls turned the color of rust as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the wind that rolled down from the forest carried the sound of bells that should not have been ringing. The sheriff drove through the empty streets, his headlights cutting through dust and smoke, every house dark, every curtain drawn, yet he could feel eyes following him through the glass. He turned the radio on out of habit, but all he heard was static beneath it, a faint rhythm like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, endless. When he reached the station, the door was ajar. The lights off, he stepped inside, calling for Deputy Callahan, but there was no answer. Only the low hum of the police scanner cycling through empty frequencies, and somewhere in the static a voice whispering his name. He followed it to the back room where the tape recorder sat on his desk, returned as if it had never been stolen. The evidence tag still attached to the machine already running on its own. The reel spinning slow. The sound that came through was not the interview, not the panic, not the screams, but something new. A congregation chanting in unison, their voices layered and deep, repeating the same line again and again, "We are the hollow." We wait for the return, and beneath the chant, another voice, older, colder. The same one from the cave, speaking in a language that made his skin crawl when it stopped. There was silence, then a single phrase spoken in perfect English. "It is time." The lights flickered once, then went out. He grabbed his flashlight and ran to the door, but the moment he stepped outside, he froze. The entire town square was filled with people standing in rows, candles in their hands, faces, blank eyes reflecting the flame at the front of them. Stood Pastor Leeds, dressed in black robes, a circle painted on the ground around him, the same inverted cross from the chapel, only now drawn with salt and ash. He raised his arms and the crowd began to hum. The sound, low and harmonic, vibrating through the ground. Dorsey shouted for them to stop, but his voice vanished beneath the noise. He fired his revolver once into the air. The echo cracked across the square, but no one moved. They only turned toward him in perfect unison, their voices rising until it felt like the air itself was shaking. Leeds stepped forward, his face a calm, his eyes hollow. He said, "They have returned, Sheriff, and you brought them home." Then he pointed toward the hill, and Dorsey turned just in time to see the horizon move, as if the forest itself were breathing smoke pouring upward from the ruins of St. Bartholomew's, the trees bending under a wind that came from nowhere. He saw shapes in the smoke, not human, not animal forms that twisted and dissolved as quickly as they appeared. He backed away, but the crowd closed in around him, hundreds of eyes unblinking, candle flames shaking in rhythm to some pulse that came from beneath the earth. The sheriff tried to push through, but hands reached out, grabbing his coat, his arms, his throat whispering words that were not words, just sound ancient and hungry. He tore free, stumbled toward his truck and slammed the door, locking it with trembling fingers when he looked up through the windshield. Every face in town was turned toward him, every mouth moving in the same silent prayer. The bells were still ringing somewhere far away, though there were no churches left to ring them, and above the rooftops the smoke from Chapel Hill had thickened into a column that glowed faint red from within, like a vein pulsing beneath the skin of the sky. He started the engine and drove blind through the fog until the lights of town disappeared in the mirror behind him. He did not stop until the forest swallowed the road. He pulled over, shaking his hands, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles bled. He looked back toward Whitefish Falls and saw the glow rising brighter with every second, and he knew then that whatever lived beneath that chapel had never wanted worship. It had wanted witnesses. He drove until the forest swallowed the last trace of the town, the road turning to dirt, the sky thick with ash, the headlights barely cutting through the smoke, and even with the windows closed he could still hear the chanting somewhere far behind him, rising and falling like the tide. He stopped when the engine began to sputter and stepped out into the cold, his flashlight beam carving a narrow path between the trees. Every branch seemed to lean toward him, dripping moisture that smelled of iron. He followed the faint orange glow on the horizon until he reached the ridge above Chapel Hill. The ruins below pulsed with light. Not fire, not electricity, but something breathing. The ground shifting in slow waves, as if something massive was turning beneath it. He crouched low, watching figures move around the crater, dozens of them. Torches raised faces, pale mouths open in silent prayer. The pastor stood at the center, his robe spread like wings, and in front of him 3 crosses of wood half burned, but still standing nailed to each one was a photograph, the faces of the missing teenagers. Thomas Reed, Claire Dawson, Mark Halpern, the edges curling from heat, but their eyes untouched, staring straight into the dark behind him. Dorsey's stomach turned when he realized that the chanting was not coming from the people, it was coming from the ground from below the hill, like a voice buried under the earth calling to its children. He crept closer, boots sinking into mud, thick and warm, until he reached the edge of the crater where the trap door had once been now blown open by something unseen. The tunnel below glowing faintly red. He heard a sound rising through it like breathing mixed with wind. Then words forming the vessel must be emptied. The light must feed the hollow. He pointed his flashlight down the shaft and saw shapes writhing far below, hundreds of them. Human and not human bones gleaming through skin mouths stretched wide as if caught in endless prayer. He stumbled back, gasping, his foot catching on something soft. He looked down and saw a hand, pale and thin, half buried in the dirt. It twitched, once, then stilled, and when he pulled it free, a small brass cross fell from its fingers engraved with the initials C.D. He stared at it, shaking his head, whispering "no" over and over. But he already knew what it meant. He forced himself to look again, and there they were, just beyond the edge of his light. 3 figures standing side by side, the teenagers, their faces gray, their eyes like mirrors, their clothes torn but untouched by time. Claire spoke first, her voice calm and hollow. "Sheriff, you should not have come." He tried to speak, but his throat locked. She stepped closer, her feet leaving no prints. Thomas looked at him and said, "It's not over. They opened it, and it needs more." He whispered, "What needs more?" But Mark answered for them, "The faith you gave them." The faith they turned into hunger. Behind them, the ground cracked open, the light surging upward, and for a second he saw what lived beneath the hill, a mass of faces shifting like smoke, 1,000 mouths speaking in perfect unison. "We are the hollow. We wait for the return." He turned and ran, stumbling through the trees, the air vibrating with the sound of wings that were not wings. the glow behind him flaring until the forest turned white, and then silence. Absolute silence, like the world had stopped breathing. When he finally reached the road, he collapsed beside his truck, the sky above him still trembling. Faint sparks falling like ash from a fire that had no source. He drove without thinking, his eyes fixed on the pale dawn breaking over the mountains behind him. The town still glowed faintly red, but no sound came from it. No voices, no bells, just that slow pulse under the ground fading, then returning like a heartbeat refusing to die. He whispered their names once more. Thomas, Claire, Mark, and for the first time he realized they had never been the victims. They had been the door 50 years later. The forest around Whitefish Falls had grown thick again, the ruins of the chapel long covered by moss and silence. Only the memorial stone at the town's edge remained a slab of granite weathered smooth by rain. The names carved into it almost erased. Thomas Reed, Claire Dawson, Mark Halpern, and beneath them the words forever ascended. The town itself had changed new roads, new faces, a grocery store where the sheriff's office once stood, a school rebuilt after the old one burned in '82, and a church that no one ever entered, standing empty on the hill like a monument to faith. No one trusted anymore. Most of the people who had lived through that autumn were gone, their children gone too, and the story of the fire had become nothing more than a local ghost tale told to tourists in the diner at night. But in the spring of 2024, construction began on the outskirts of town, a developer clearing the forest for new homes. And on the third day, one of the workers hit something solid beneath his backhoe, thinking it was stone. He climbed down to check what he uncovered was metal, corroded but intact. When they pried it open, the earth released a breath that had waited half a century inside the box was a tape recorder, its reels still sealed in wax-labeled Confession Reverend A.G. The sheriff's department, now run by younger men who had never heard the real story, sent it to the state lab. The recording restored, and played for the first time since 1974. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. Slow, measured calm. Reverend Albert Graves. He said the fire was not meant to destroy. It was meant to seal what we opened. We thought we were serving light, but the light we found was hollow. It spoke through the children. It promised purity, and it took them the night they disappeared. They went willingly. They thought they were saving us, but it wanted more. It wanted faith. And we gave it everything. Then the voice broke a sound like weeping, followed by a whisper. If you hear this, leave it buried. Do not dig. Do not return. The vessel must remain full. The audio ended with a faint knock on wood 3 times. Then silence. Investigators dismissed it as theater. But one woman listening alone in her office noticed something beneath the recording. Another voice, younger, fainter, repeating a phrase that did not match Graves's words. We are still here below the hill. When she ran the waveform analysis, it showed 3 separate speakers layered into the static matching the age and tone of the missing teenagers. 2 weeks later, she disappeared on her drive home. Her car found abandoned near Miller Creek Bridge, engine running, driver's side door. Open headlights pointing toward the forest. No signs of struggle, no footprints, no body, just a small brass cross on the dashboard engraved with 3 letters. AG, the state closed the case citing insufficient evidence, but the audio leaked online within days. Conspiracy forums lit up with theories. Locales reported strange lights moving between the trees near Chapel Hill. Again, some said they heard church bells after midnight, though there were no churches left to ring them. Others claimed to see 3 figures walking along the road holding candles, their faces hidden by shadow. Every time someone followed them, the lights vanished, leaving behind only the smell of burnt wood and wet soil. And now, every year, on the anniversary of the fire, the town gathers at sunset, not to pray, not to remember, but to listen. The ground beneath the hill still hums faintly, like a voice rising through the roots of the trees, a sound that is not wind, not thunder, just the slow rhythm of faith feeding on fear, waiting for someone to believe again, waiting for the next soul curious enough to dig. Because in Whitefish Falls, the light never died. It only changed hands. Some secrets do not fade. They wait. If you were in Whitefish Falls that night, what do you think you would have done? Would you have looked away or followed the light? Let me know in the comments. Like this video if the story kept you watching, and subscribe for more real cases that never truly sleep.